Rachel Scholl, and welcome to Fuck the Canon. I'm here today with my friend
Allyce Torres.
and we are talking to Leah Holleran, who is a theater artist and essayist based in Philadelphia. So thank you so much for coming to my apartment and talking with me about these wonderful writings.
Yeah.
I have reached out to a lot of writers, and Leah got back to me with this essay that was published, and as soon as I read it, the first person I thought of was you. And I think part of it is I internet stalk everyone, like we all do.
Yeah.
And I've read all of your personal writings about your mental health journeys, and it just... her work really spoke to me in a way that yours speaks to me. And I'm curious, what was the process for you of writing your own work? How did that develop, where it felt like making those essays, putting that out in the world was something that you wanted to do?
Yeah. So I have been struggling with and in recovery from an eating disorder for 15 years. Since basically I was really 13 years old. And when I graduated college, it was the first time where education wasn't a constant, and also where my perfectionism wasn't getting consistent daily validation of yes, you get an A on this test, or you get an A in participation in a program, or I was the head of everything, always, always. I was the president of every club, and I was the star in the shows, and always getting validated in a very direct way. And so then when school stopped, I had a really difficult time transitioning out of that. So my best friend and I, when we had moved to Chicago, I was really struggling, and I met with a therapist who suggested that I start keeping a blog, an accountability blog, and share it with maybe one or two people. And it was a Tumblr page, because hello. But it was a Tumblr page that I would just kind of write these little missives on, and I had shared it with my two best friends. And, do I think in retrospect that was the best thing or the most healthy thing to have? No, especially not with for my friends. I don't think it was the healthiest thing at all, but it was a really great way for me to begin to think about how I actually was feeling and why I was doing some of the behaviors that I was doing. I guess look at them on the page and see them back and feel it sinking into wow, I didn't even realize that me saying I feel fat isn't the same thing as what I actually mean. What I actually meant was I feel alone, or I feel scared. So that was the first time where I was able to externalize that and see it. And it was a huge part of my healing process. So I had amassed this kind of long history of these tiny essays, and poetry is what I really started with, because that's where I think a lot of people like me usually start. And I've been in a couple of different blog platforms. I've been invited to speak with a lot of organizations about my history. And then I started writing a play that was a process started in college and then has kind of had its own life, called Skin Deep. And it's devised and changed, and then become a part of my own performance. It used to have many different people's stories, and then it kind of just became my story. And and then I recently, just this year, was published in a magazine, in Reach Women's magazine, for the first time. So it's my first physical publication, and
That's exciting.
That was pretty dope.
Yeah.
So,
and you talk about it being healing, but so much of what you write is so poetic, even when it's essay form. And I'm curious, do those essays, those Tumblr posts, inspire your artistic life as well?
Yeah, I think that my writing is super helpful for my acting. I think that my writing is super supplementary to my directing. I think it's part of the reason why I'm able to tell good stories. But I think one of the best things that my writing actually has taught me is to let go of some of my perfectionism. So when I write, I kind of let myself just free form. I really try not to edit. And I've really had to learn not to put a nice little bow on the end of my stories, because I think, and this is something that I remember Leah said also in her blog post, is that there's this impulse to be I'm good now, right? Like, this was this terrible thing that I went through, and now I am fine. Where it's like, that's not really how recovery works. It's not how trauma works. It's not how grief works. I think it's something that you can be fine and you can be better, but not every story is going to end that way.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And it's so interesting. You said all, people like you start with poetry. When my dad died, I was given a journal by a neighbor and was like, I think you're going to need this. And I wrote the worst poetry you've probably ever read. But it was a coping mechanism for me. It was a way that I was able to process the emotions that I was having in a way that wasn't like where I didn't have to, because I was in therapy at the time as well, but I didn't have to like set goals. I didn't have to like make distinct points. I could just free flow and write and not quantify it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's also something kind of like freeing, I think, about poetry where it can be a little bit like messier, or it can be a little more suggestive, and you don't have to necessarily say things totally explicitly. Like, you can say things in a way that might be a little bit more hidden or secretive, and so in that way, for me at least, it feels safer to start with poetry and talk from there. Also, when I had just graduated college, I was reading Sylvia Plath's journals, and her journals are so full of poetry, and it was the first time where I ever felt like I saw myself on a page, was reading her work, and it was really inspiring for me to start there.
Yeah. And I think, you said it's easier to express emotion in poetry, and I think part of that, like, that is so true. I think part of why it's so true is because emotions are so messy. And I know that when I try and write fiction that's in sort of a prose form, it feels constraining in a way where it's like, I just want to be messy and not end the sentence or make it a run-on and then not worry about it.
Yeah.
That's so real.
Yeah. I also think maybe this is the part of like acting feeding back into the writing is that, theater, I've always been really, really drawn towards theater that was more magical realism, less, I guess, more like imaginative and more poetic anyway. So I feel like that is the voice that just sits better inside my brain and can be translated better when I'm trying to express myself.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting. I've done a number of devising things. I've done a couple solo shows, and I know that the first solo show I ever wrote was like pure therapy. Like, I was in college. It was, it was right after George W. Bush was elected for the second time, and I was pretty religious at that time too. And it was about like putting all of that together with the fact that it was the 10-year anniversary of my dad's death. And so it was like this whole church service is what it was. And I remember I did like one performance of it, and my mom was in the room. And there was a point I got to the play where I realized my mom was going to listen to me do something, and I just lost it and broke down. And I'm so grateful that I had that experience, and I can look back now and be like, that was therapy. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's so interesting how, especially as theater makers, we put so much of ourselves into our work, but that we have to, like, we can't break ourselves down every single night on stage. Like, we have to take care of ourselves as well.
Yeah. I think that's just something that, like I said, I try really hard to draw that line between bringing myself into my acting or bringing my story into my work as a theater artist is because, I used to have that attachment where I qualified my illness with my goodness of being an artist. And I think that that's something that a lot of people can probably relate to, the idea of like the suffering artist and like being sad somehow makes like better art. And I did a lot of work to really let that go, because I think what I've learned is you really can't make art at all, much less good art, if you are not okay. If the core center of yourself is not like fully sound and fully taken care of, then all you're doing is whittling away at the center, giving parts of yourself to different plays and different theater companies and different artists until, at the end of the day, there's nothing left except for a tiny little whittled down toothpick of what you were before.
Right.
For so long, theater was a huge part of why I definitely think it fed my eating disorder a lot, because I would see very direct responses when I was either at when I was at one body weight versus at a different body weight. People would give me different responses, and whichever of the responses I felt was more desirable, that totally fed my eating disorder and was like, yes, right, we have to be like pretty and all the other things that like the industry tells us pretty is. Right. And that's not gone. That's still there. So as someone who's like actively in recovery, it's a really difficult conversation to have to continue to check in with myself. Like, I have this one piece that I've written called The Patron Saint of Eating Disorders, where a lot of times I will share my writing about my eating disorder experience, and I'll have a bunch of women come forward to me, and men and non-binary folks come forward and say, you know, I really resonate with this. This is my experience. And then they'll disclose, or they'll tell me, like, they'll ask me for help, and there's so much of an impulse to want to fix it. And that's the perfectionism, right? Wanting to fix it and wanting my story to be the thing that provides healing for other people. And I've really had to continue also to do that work, to let that go and not let that affect me, because then it's feeding back in. So, yeah, I think that idea of, like, presenting a brilliant and thriving self is just really pervasive.
And I have had periods where I've just been furious that, like, artists, people who are creating worlds, are still buying into stereotypes.
Yeah.
So, you know, thank you for breaking us out of them.
Yeah. I think it's been, you know, aside from just the body aspect, or I guess I should say more the size aspect of things too. Another thing that's always been a part of my body is that I'm biracial. So walking into spaces, there's always somebody trying to decide, like, if I'm Mexican enough to do this, if I'm white enough to do that, if I'm too tall or have too much hair to do something, right? There's always this discussion about my body and my body being a problem. That was a huge part of my eating disorder, massively, so much more that I didn't even realize until just this year how much my race was a part of my eating disorder.
Really?
Yeah, I really didn't even think about it. I had a woman reach out to me, and she was looking for folks to interview about, she was looking for Latinx folks to talk to about their eating disorder journey and their treatment journey. And as I was talking to this therapist who I've never met, she was just a clinician who's writing a book about it. Okay. And her goal in writing the book is to create better culturally informed spaces for treatment. And while she was talking to me on the phone, I just, like, realized, like, I had all these breakthroughs where I was like, holy shit, my whole life has been trying to fit myself into either the theatrical standard of, like, being beautiful and what that means to them, or, like, fitting myself into being white or being Mexican, like one of the two. I've always been trying to, like, reshape my body into one of these things. Yeah, it's, like, super, super huge, I think, to be able to write my own story and tell my own story, because it creates more space for me.
Right. And I think so much of what we see in the media about ED recovery is so whitewashed.
Yeah. When I've worked with, you know, some therapists in the past, has been totally harmful, because they'll either say something like, oh, well, women of color, like, don't get eating disorders, or, like, there's, you know, it's culturally less known for people who identify as Latinx to be, one, to even know that they have an eating disorder, to be diagnosed with one, and then to get treatment. There's all these barriers to access. Also, treatment is fucking expensive.
Right.
So, you know, then going home to tell your family, who doesn't know what eating disorders are, asking them to get you into treatment and pay so much money to get you into treatment is absolutely not going to happen. So, so many Latinx folks go untreated, and possibly even go their whole life without realizing that they have an eating disorder. So it's a really, it was a really difficult thing for me to kind of realize on the phone how much the two were inextricably linked.
Yeah. Part of what I really appreciated about Leah's article was just the way she talked about navigating through grief and navigating through trauma. And I think it's something that I love about talking to artists who are also writers. So I think we know how to explain our experiences and know that our experiences are our own, but that they through that are universal. And so like I've never lost a friend to an overdose. I've never cut myself or had those mental health issues, but I saw myself in that article. And I'm curious, for you, were there parts where you resonated with her writing?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I attached to in Leah's article was, I mean, obviously the discussion about trying to physicalize the harm through self-harm, the pain through self-harm, definitely resonates. The control aspect there that she talks about, trying to control the pain in some way and control the secrets and control the narrative, is definitely something that I have seen reflected in my own life, in my own story. But I mean, especially the piece about grief is, I think, so real, that there is a power of grief that if you let yourself get wrapped up into it, there are so many healing things you can find in the grief that I think are not what so many people try to tell us, right? There's a lot of things that people always say, like, move on or let the person go or like whatever, which is impossible to do. Right. When I lost my student earlier this year, I found so much comfort in thinking about her, and in remembering her. And I think that that's something that I don't think a lot of people tell us to do, but is a really healing way to like find a new version of yourself out of it. I mean, I think I am a better teacher because of it, and I think that I am a better artist because of it. I think I'm a more conscious teacher and a more conscious person because I'm able to infuse the importance of life in my day-to-day teaching and life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm Sarah.
I'm Allie.
It's really nice to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real joy reading your work.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry if my responses are a little bit delayed because of Skype, but it's great to be talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of my first question, because you sent us your essay first, and then we were able to get your theater writing later, about the process of writing for you. Did you start doing theater and then moved into essay work? Have you been doing both at the same time throughout?
So my first love in writing, and in a way my main pursuit, is actually fiction, but I've always been an actor and a performer. And I think essay writing kind of is, I love a lot of types of writing, but I think my performance life kind of came first, and then I discovered that I could integrate my performance and my love for fiction in a really cool way with theater and devising. So that was sort of the process there. And essay writing, I guess, like, as a thing, was a little bit more like, hey, I think I want to branch more into writing as opposed to really focusing on acting. And this is another cool thing that I can do to also try and make a little bit of money and be like, yes, Mom, I promise I'm making a living with art.
Yeah. When did that transition happen for you? When did you start doing more essay writing?
Fairly recently. I've been a professional actor for a lot of years, and that was my main pursuit for most of my life up until maybe a year or two ago, when I started thinking that maybe writing was a little bit more what I wanted to focus on.
Cool. Awesome. So we read your essay first, and I'm curious, were you approached by this particular blog to write this? Was it something that you had written and then submitted to other places?
No, it started out as just a Facebook post.
Awesome.
It was to the Facebook group in memory of my friend, and then I saw an advertisement, I think, from this blog being like, we're seeking mental health stories, and I felt that it fit very well, so I submitted it to them, and that's kind of how that happened.
Awesome.
I am someone who also writes about mental health and my struggles with mental health, and I'm interested in when you started writing the piece and what format, I guess, it was in that you began writing the piece, and how did it grow, and how long did it take you to share it with other people?
Yeah, sure. That piece in particular, like I said, it actually started out in the form of a post to a Facebook group, mainly just talking about my tattoo and how it was in memory of my friend. Probably took a couple of weeks to develop it into the piece that I submitted, and then I worked with the editor to make cuts and changes and certain additions. But in terms of sharing that story itself, it's kind of something I've been like trying to do and not totally sure how to do it for a very long time. And actually, I have a YA novel. It's fiction, it's sci-fi, but it's very much based on my experience with my friend and dealing with that kind of grief. And I'm trying to shop it to literary agents right now. But the very first version of that story I wrote in high school when I was 16, and I've been trying to get that story out for like over 10 years. And when I finally finished the manuscript of this one novel, it did feel a little bit like, wow, okay, like that was cathartic. Maybe now there are other stories in me, not sure. Kind of scary to not know, but like it definitely kind of let the floodgates open finally, which was really nice.
That's great. And I'm curious, with this particular novel, using this story and sort of mining this personal experience, how much of yourself do you feel like are in those characters, and how much do you feel like you're able to move beyond yourself and create that fictional world?
Yeah, I think I actually needed to move beyond myself in a lot of ways. I actually changed the gender of one of the characters from the truth of the story because I felt like I needed that distance in order to not have the pressure of this has to be an accurate portrayal and this fictional thing has to somehow be exactly a replica of my friend, which was obviously never going to be possible. So although there's definitely a lot of me in the characters, particularly the one who has to deal with her friend's death, it is very much a fictionalized version of it in the sense that the characters are not directly proportional to real people. They're all kind of mixes of different parts of what the experience was. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, absolutely. Do you ever worry about sharing those stories, knowing that people who are maybe like models on characters in the story are going to be reading them?
Absolutely.
Yes.
It was even like that with the mental health essay, where in a way it was even more like that because I did use real names.
Oh wow.
And I realized afterwards that maybe I shouldn't have done that, but whoops.
Oh well. Yeah.
But I very much was like, I hope that this portrayal is not. It's never going to be 100% perfect, and I'm very straightforward that obviously it's from one viewpoint, which is mine. So it's not going to be 100% accurate, but I always hope to try and represent people as truthfully and honestly as I can. And if there's something really sensitive, I try and talk to the person about it before I put the story out into the world. But yeah, with the fiction, it's really scary because I even know, I let some of my family read the novel and stuff like that, and my parents were like, oh, this character's this person, right? And I was like, actually, no, that's totally not true. It's weird you got that, and I wonder if they're going to think that and be offended.
Wow. Yeah, that's real. That's super real.
Yeah.
So I'd love to take notes when I'm reading things, when I know I'm going to be talking to the author, just because I always latch on to specific sentences that sort of strike me. So there were a couple in your essay, if we're starting with that. And I think the one that I know I am still feeling is we are all under such constant pressure to present ourselves as nothing less than our best, to dismiss distress as just stress, and act like we're fine, and not only fine, but brilliantly thriving. And I think I struggle with the presentation of self that we have on social media. And that was just a moment that really struck with me. So thank you for that, definitely.
Also to my editor of that particular essay, because that was one of the things that I talked about with him, that he was kind of just like, oh yeah, you should add those things into your essay. And I was like, okay. So thanks, Gabe.
Yeah, I think it's so hard also as actors, right? And or like theater artists in general, because a lot of our online presence is part of our career presence and our ability to get jobs and network with other theater artists in that way. So I often get the piece of advice: you should always be posting your work, or you should always be posting yourself, like being really happy about your work and being really successful, creating this image of success and joy and fullness. And that's, I mean, at least for me, that's like so often not the case. So yeah, I think that really strikes true for me as well.
And I also think it's interesting because I think in my experience of actually making work, trying to be perfect is sort of the antithesis of actually creating.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It makes it impossible to come up with anything. It just freezes you up, at least I've found. Like, it's really impossible to innovate when you're just afraid of making a mistake.
Yeah.
And that's taught me that. And like, so I may have mentioned this, I don't know. So I have a blog that I've been keeping about me and my husband. We created a puppet show together, and for our honeymoon, we toured around Europe for 14 weeks, which was really awesome. But man, building that puppet show was so fucking hard, and like writing it, and yeah, just the whole thing was very much like we had to keep coming to each other and being like, hey, we can fail, and that's okay. Because that's the only way that we're going to be able to do this, is if we acknowledge the fact that we might fail. Like, it's a very real possibility. And if it happens, that's okay. And it was really hard to fully embrace that. Like, my brain would be like, yes, true. And my body would be like, no, I reject failure. Absolutely not. And so,
Well, and I think especially when you're making work to make a living, like when you need to pay your bills, the idea of failure is scary because it's like, I need to survive. So I need to just keep making and keep doing and just assume that it's going to be brilliant. Because if I don't, then I can't eat.
Yeah, exactly. And to bring it back to the social media thing, it's kind of a terrible cycle, because it winds up being the situation where even when things aren't fine, you feel like you have to pretend that they are in order to make it fine. But that means you're not talking about what you need. And so your needs are continuing to not get met. And it's just this terrible cycle of like, yes, my life is great, but really it's terrible. And that's a deeper and deeper and deeper secret that I can't tell anybody.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of scary.
Yeah.
I'm also a puppeteer. So yeah, I'm a hand puppeteer. So a lot of like Punch and Judy style wood puppets.
Awesome.
But I'm super interested in, I guess, you as a puppeteer and why some of the work that I was reading of yours, why puppets as your vehicle?
Yeah. I mean, so I think a lot of the work that I sent over actually was not puppetry, with the exception of enchantment.
Right.
But I just kind of, so one of the things that my husband and I both feel that we really love about puppetry is the way that it's kind of like this visceral magic of bringing everyday objects to life and giving them life. And you kind of get that blending of worlds in a way, where you have our normal reality, you have the mundane side of things, and then you have a very physically real thing that is still very much kind of from another world. Like, puppets are just really cool that way. And so I love using that to bring stories to life. And I'm also just very much like, I have a very strong sense that like certain stories lend themselves to certain mediums, and so it really also does just depend on the story itself.
Yeah. One other quote that really resonated with me personally from the essay that we read was you talking about walking between the kitchen and your bedroom where your parents told you about Dee. And I'm just going to read it because it is so beautifully worded. In the endless walk between the kitchen and my bedroom, I knew in my bones they were about to tell me Dee was dead. And even though I already knew when the words came out of my mother's mouth, I was so stunned to hear them aloud that I actually laughed. And something I was saying to Allie before we called you was just about how it seems like all of us are inspired by the trauma that we've had in our lives, and that plays a role into the art that we make. And for me, one of the most visceral memories I have of childhood is my dad died when I was 11, and I can remember going into the kitchen when all of my family had showed up because I had been hiding upstairs, going into the kitchen and my sister seeing me and telling my grandfather to take me into my bedroom, and walking from the kitchen to the bedroom knowing that he was going to tell me my dad died, and still not being able to process it until he said the words out loud.
Yeah. I mean, I think I even said it in that essay, the words, you don't realize how much you need to hear them in order to make it true until that happens. And that's why I had to actually go back to my parents and be like, say it again, because I need to make sure that it's real. And I'm calling people and telling them this terrible thing, that our friend is dead. And that better not be a mistake. That better be real if I'm calling people and telling them that. So I need you to say the words again. And I don't know. It's crazy. I don't know if it's that language is powerful, or if it's just that you need some kind of, you need to put it outside of yourself in order for it to feel true. I don't know exactly what it is, but
well, it's such a, earlier this year, one of my, I'm a teacher, and one of my students passed away from a long battle with cancer. And it was so impossible. I mean, the idea, I think at least for this situation with something like cancer, you have always this understanding that it might happen, right? Someone might pass, someone might not be there anymore. So I remember I used to imagine what it would feel like if somebody told me that had actually happened, or what that day would be like. And when that day actually came, I couldn't believe that it was actually happening. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And I think that it's because the curtain of someone being here and someone not being here is so, it's abrupt. It's when you see this person in your day-to-day life, you can't imagine them not being there anymore. And I think the language sometimes helps just to continue to say no, this moment is over. This is a new phase of your relationship with this person. Now they're no longer here.
Another author that we're talking to for this series had this really eloquent way of talking about grief, where he talked about how a friend of his was talking about her mother dying, and it was like she was watching the train of her previous life leave the station, and she was just waving it goodbye. And I think that's something that I know I'm still realizing, is how much grief has changed who I am. And it is. It's you were this one person, and then this thing happens to you, and now you're someone else.
Yeah.
And I think that transition takes time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I actually the way that I wrote the novel that I wrote. It's in sections kind of.
Okay.
And part of it is from the perspective of the character who loses her friend, and part of it is third person, but it's kind of over the shoulder of the friend who passes away. But the whole book is split into before and after, and the chapters kind of alternate, and they're labeled before and after, and it's before his death and after his death, and it's very much I didn't even realize until I finished it that I was oh, that's how I view my life. Sure, convenient, fun storytelling thing, but it's very much not just and it's you said, it's not just my life, it's also me as a person. I was a different person before it happened. And and it's one of those weird things too, where it's I like who I am as a human being right now. And I everybody has challenges that make them who they are, and we come to terms with them how we can, and we are all striving to figure out ways to like ourselves, right? But like, it's one of those things too where whenever people are like, oh, well, you know, if you could go back in time and change something, what would you change? I'm always kind of like, part of me wants to say that thing, but part of me is like, just that question throws me into a weird loop where I'm like, you never know what other terrible things are going to happen after you change this one thing. And like, obviously, her death was not about me at all, like, in any way. But that doesn't mean that it didn't become a big part of my life.
Right.
And like, I'm glad of the things that I learned from dealing with it. And like, obviously, I would trade all of it if she were back and like happy in her life.
Right.
But that's not really enough anyway. So it's just kind of like, it's crazy to think about how like I liked my life before, but I also like the me of after.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I feel that way palpably. You know, there were times when I was younger and we would think about what would have happened if my dad hadn't died, and there are people who might, you know, ask me now, and it's been over 20 years for me since my dad died, so like I have lived 3 times a life that I knew my dad, like and it's like literally everything that I have is a result of that happening. Like I would be a completely different person. I probably wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be married to the person I'm married to. I wouldn't be talking to you. Like, it's like everything would be different. And I find that thought experiment not only isn't helpful, but can actually be detrimental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also definitely true that time is a huge factor, because I mean, like, right after it happened, I spent a whole lot of years hating myself, and like that's very much what that essay is about.
Yeah.
And so it's not to say that it's like easy, I'm gonna make you a better person kind of thing, but yeah, exactly what you were saying, like the thought experiment of if you could change it is not a helpful one.
Yeah. So I love your solo show that you haven't done yet.
Oh, thanks.
And I think you need to do it because I think I don't know about you, but like I know I read that and I was like, yes, that is what it's like to be a woman.
Yeah.
Yes and yes and yes. What was the process of creating that?
It kind of started with like a seed of an idea of wanting to, because like one thing about me is that I just always have struggled with like, I'm just nice. I'm such a people pleaser. It's like stupid how much I'm a people pleaser. And I'm like, okay, like it's great to be compassionate. I don't want to lose that part of myself, but I need to stop being so fucking nice and like be more truthful.
And so that's just so interesting how nice and truthful aren't the same thing.
Yeah, they're so not. Often they're odds, I find, for me. And so that was kind of where the seeds of the project came from, and I really liked the idea. I'm like really, really intrigued by super interactive theater, like immersive theater, where your audience is brought into the world of the show physically, and they're part of it and they're surrounded by it. Yeah. And so I was like, oh, that could be cool, like dinner party could be great. Also because I have this, like, I've gotten much better, but I've like been a really terrible cook for a really long time, like kind of scared of the kitchen type thing. So I was like, use that very easily. These two ideas are congruent. And then I worked with a good friend and respected colleague of mine, Tara Demi, who kind of workshopped it with me as a director. And she did a lot of clowning work with me, which is really cool, to help find like the voice and the physicality of the character, and like, are there rules that we want to set up? What's the structure of this for the audience? Like, and so that kind of is where a lot of the specifics in there came from, was the work that I did with her. And I've always found, especially with theater, like such a collaborative process, which is just the beauty of it. And so I find that like, that's why with my own writing, it's like mostly essays and fiction, whereas like when I work in the medium of theater, I'm like, just get me in a room with people. Like, let's just play around and do stuff. So, yeah.
So like, what are you reading right now that you're really loving?
Right now I'm reading the Dark Tower series, Stephen King, which is, I'm such a fantasy nerd, and so I love that. And I also actually recently read On Writing by Stephen King.
Oh, great.
Which I really enjoyed. Like, it was just a really nice balance between kind of an insight into his life and a little bit of memoir and like writing instruction, but more like writing instruction light, where he's like, there's not a right way, here's how I do some stuff, and like here are some ideas. And I think everyone's heard the like kill your darlings quote from him, but there's a lot of other fun stuff in there as well that I found really useful in thinking about writing as well. So
awesome.
Yeah,
very good. And where are you in the series?
I am just starting the 4th book.
Okay. And how many are there? I don't know actually.
I want to say 7.
Yeah.
But I might be.
No, that's right.
Have you read them?
Yeah, there's 7. I love them so much. They're
so
very good.
great.
They are.
What is it about them that is so wonderful? I've read some of his work, but not a lot of it, to be honest.
This is I've read some of his work as well, and this is actually some of my favorite. I mean, part of it is really great world building, and really intriguing character building. And I think for me, it's a little bit like, it's the pace as well. Like, it's page turner. I'm like, all right, like, I'm all about all this crazy shit that's happening right now. So like, yeah, and I think part of what's so great about it is I love stories that kind of bring an unlikely group of characters together, and that's so much what this is. Sorry, my stupid battery thing. Yeah, it's so much just like this eclectic bunch is tied together into that, like, this is their fate to like be this. I mean, you know, they call it cop, but whatever.
Sure.
But yeah, it's just really amazing how you get really deep insights into each of these characters and how vastly different their lives are, and then they're brought together in the way that their personalities mesh and that they work together and become this beautiful unit is always like really intriguing to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a joy.
I'm so glad.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. That's awesome.
And it was so nice to talk to Leah and get her perspective on everything.
Yeah, she was really smart.
Yeah. So we will link Leah's essay as well as the books that she was talking about reading, Stephen King, which, I mean, I really need to read those. I haven't. But you said you recommend them as well.
Oh, yeah. Very good. I mean, like, you have to be someone who, like, enjoys fantasy, and you also have to be, like, someone who doesn't mind reading Stephen King. But, yes. It is good.
But we'll link all of those. Please make sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day, friends.